Alan Watts often spoke of transformation not as something gentle and gradual, but as something that feels at first like dissolution. The most profound discovery in his reflections on human sensitivity and suffering was that the journey of the empath, from being wounded and fragile to becoming a warrior of consciousness, requires facing the shadow. It is a passage that either consumes the sensitive individual, leaving them broken, or reveals a strength they never believed they possessed. To Watts, this was not a trivial psychological adjustment, but one of the deepest mysteries of human growth, for it demonstrates that what appears as weakness can, when understood, become the root of wisdom and resilience. In his talks on self-realization in the archetype of the healer, Watts drew attention to a recurring pattern he saw in people who felt deeply, what we could call sensitivity transformation. Certain individuals, endowed with extraordinary receptivity to the emotions of others, were fated to make a choice. Either they remained prisoners of victimhood, replaying their pain endlessly and making it the core of their identity, or they undertook the perilous task of shadow integration, confronting what had been disowned and learning to hold the whole of themselves with compassion. For Watts, this was no minor matter. It was the difference between remaining caught in endless suffering and becoming truly alive, truly awake. He spoke of wounded healer potential, the remarkable capacity to turn inner wounds into sources of wisdom. But this potential is realized only when the person stops identifying with the wound itself and instead sees it as teacher, as guide. If they cling to the wound, believing it defines them, they remain locked in sorrow. But if they choose integration, the shift is not a slow progression, it is alchemical. The whole pattern of the psyche rearranges itself. What seemed like a curse becomes a resource, and what once threatened to destroy becomes the very ground of power. This, Watts insisted, is not just personal healing, it is the task of humanity itself. To turn unconscious suffering into conscious strength, to integrate the shadow, and in so doing to develop an authentic self that is neither masked nor fractured. In the transformation of the empath lies the very model of individuation, the awakening of a person into wholeness. Watts told stories of those who could heal others, yet remained wounded themselves. He saw the paradox of the healer who refuses to heal. Imagine a person capable of offering profound comfort, insight, even wisdom to another, yet unable to apply that wisdom to their own soul. They resist healing as though it were a threat. Their wound becomes their identity, their treasured possession, something they fear losing. And why? Because healing seems to endanger the very qualities that make them special: their empathy, their connection to suffering, their sense of purpose. Watts noted that they confuse being hurt with being helpful, suffering with sensitivity, victimhood with virtue. He was disturbed to realize that this was not a rare case, but a widespread phenomenon among sensitive souls. He observed that many people sabotage their own healing unconsciously, afraid that if they grow whole, they will lose the very depth of feeling that connects them to others. They think that psychological health might mean dullness, ordinariness, or indifference. But the truth, as Watts reminded us, is the opposite. Only by integrating what we fear can empathy be made authentic and sustainable. Clinging to the wound is like clutching a burning coal and mistaking it for a jewel. It gives a sense of identity, but at the cost of endless pain. Watts explored the mechanisms by which people cling to their wounds. One is what could be called wound attachment, where pain becomes indispensable to the sense of self. Three elements perpetuate this: rejection of the shadow, fabrication of a false light persona, and refusal to accept one's own power. Many empaths present themselves as pure angels, projecting anger, selfishness, and strength onto others while keeping for themselves only the image of compassion. But by splitting in this way, they stunt their growth. They fear that embracing their power makes them identical to those who once harmed them. They confuse strength with cruelty, authority with oppression. As a result, they live in denial of their own vitality. Suffering then becomes a kind of currency. Victimhood purchases attention, sympathy, even moral authority. It gives one a role, a community, and sometimes even superiority. Watts observed people unconsciously competing over who has endured the most, wearing their scars as badges of rank in the hierarchy of pain. Healing in such a system feels like bankruptcy, losing the very capital on which one's worth is based. What lies beneath this is a kind of terror. If the wound is healed, who am I? If the pain no longer defines me, what? If these reflections are offering you a moment of clarity or calm, I warmly invite you to support Listening Mind by subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Each gesture of support helps us continue creating meaningful content and allows this community of thoughtful listeners to grow. Remains? Watts understood that this existential panic is why transformation feels like annihilation. It asks the person to let go of a known identity, however painful, and step into an unknown self. The wound feels safer because it is familiar. The integrated self is frightening precisely because it has not yet been lived. He also spoke of the addiction to powerlessness. To remain weak provides certain secret rewards: the avoidance of responsibility, protection from failure, an excuse to resist change. To be a victim means one cannot be criticized for not daring, for not striving, for not risking. It becomes a comfortable prison, and sometimes powerlessness itself becomes a method of control. By remaining helpless, one can elicit guilt, sympathy, or rescue from others, thereby meeting needs without asking directly. Watts saw this as inverted power, influence wielded through weakness rather than strength. And yet this manipulation, though unconscious, corrodes authenticity. There is also the glamour of moral superiority that suffering seems to grant. To be wounded is to appear sensitive, conscious, even spiritually advanced. This leads to what Watts called the narcissism of pain, where wounds inflate the ego rather than being integrated into wholeness. Healing in such a view seems like a loss of status, not a gain of strength. And beneath it all lies the fear of becoming an oppressor. Many empaths equate power itself with abuse, and so they shun it entirely, imagining that to be strong is to be cruel. They do not realize that conscious power, tempered with awareness, serves both self and other, while unconscious powerlessness often perpetuates harm. Watts emphasized again and again, recognizing these patterns is not about blaming oneself. It is about shining light on the unconscious dynamics that block true empowerment. For the path from wounded to warrior requires honesty about these attachments, not shame. He describes stages along this journey. At first is the unconscious absorber, the empath who feels cursed by sensitivity, overwhelmed by the emotions of others, magnetized toward toxic situations, always confirming the story of their own victimhood. The turning point comes when they see sensitivity not as punishment, but as information, as a clue to what needs to be cultivated within. Next comes the wounded helper, who uses pain to aid others, but remains unhealed within. They fear that without their suffering, they would lose their capacity to connect. They mistake their wounds for their gifts, not yet seeing that empathy deepens, not diminishes, through wholeness. Their evolution begins when they realize that healing themselves makes their service sustainable and authentic. Then appears the shadow integrator. These are empaths who start reclaiming disowned parts: anger, desire, ambition, power. They learn to stand in the paradox of being both tender and strong. This makes them less fragile, more genuine, and paradoxically more compassionate, for they no longer project their darkness outward. Finally comes the integrated warrior, the one who embodies conscious empathy, balancing deep feeling with firm boundaries, sensitivity with strength. Such people are unshakable because they are whole. They no longer fear the loss of sensitivity, for they see that strength and empathy enrich each other. Watts warned of crises along this path. Identity dissolution feels like death. Confronting the shadow can feel like corruption. Incomplete integration can inflate the ego with new pride, leading to judgment and superiority. But these are phases to be recognized, not prisons to remain in. With practices of honesty, dream work, safe expression of emotion, and above all compassion toward oneself, the integration becomes possible. The aim is not perfection, but completeness. He encouraged empaths to cultivate energetic sovereignty, to know their emotions as distinct from the emotions of others, to maintain boundaries as a way of honoring their gift. Boundaries are not walls. They are riversides that give shape to the current of empathy, preventing it from flooding everything indiscriminately. Authentic power must also be embraced, not domination, but the kind of strength that serves both individual and community. Watts pointed to examples of people who found meaning in suffering, who transformed their wounds into wisdom. They did not erase their sensitivity. They honored it by making it useful, by channeling it into creative or healing work, by refusing to let pain define them while still respecting what it had taught. They demonstrated that suffering can be transfigured into compassion, that wounds can give rise to service rather than resentment. He identified keys to success: the willingness to take responsibility for one's healing instead of waiting to be rescued, the ability to see wounds as teachers rather than as permanent markers of identity, the courage to risk losing the benefits of victimhood in exchange for authentic empowerment. Transformation requires psychological courage and the readiness to live without drama, without competition over pain, without wound-based bonding. Watts also stressed the importance of communities that support transformation, groups that honor both sensitivity and strength, that normalize growth, that encourage the integration of shadow rather than bypassing it. Such communities are places where boundaries are respected, creativity is nurtured, and empathy is expressed in ways that heal rather than drain. He described phases of integration. At first, acknowledging pain consciously, which feels worse before it feels better. Then recognizing sensitivity as a gift rather than punishment. Then building and testing boundaries, learning to disappoint others without betraying oneself. Then reclaiming power and purpose, using sensitivity as strength rather than weakness. Those who succeed become able to feel others' pain without drowning, to help without depletion, to love without self-erasure. They become teachers, healers, leaders, warriors who model healthy empathy. Yet pitfalls remain: spiritual bypassing, swinging from victim to aggressor, isolating oneself entirely, or inflating the ego with superiority. Authentic empowerment requires humility, the understanding that integration is a lifelong process. It means learning to relate with balance, to remain connected even while holding strong boundaries. Those who make the passage embody a new model of relationship. They demonstrate that intimacy thrives not through self-sacrifice, but through mutual empowerment. They show that sensitivity and strength are not opposites but partners. They remind us that humanity evolves toward wholeness each time one person turns their wound into wisdom. For the empath who integrates becomes a living proof that empathy and power can coexist, that what once wounded can become the very foundation of service. Watts' vision was clear. Empathy combined with shadow work produces resilience that cannot be destroyed. A warrior who has passed through this fire is not hardened into coldness, but softened into strength. They can witness suffering without drowning, offer compassion without losing themselves, hold love without surrendering their integrity. Sensitivity is not to be overcome, but to be refined into clarity and strength. The true task is to choose warrior over victim, to honor the wound not as identity, but as teacher, and to walk the path of integration for the sake of self and for the unfolding consciousness of humanity itself. Thank you sincerely for sharing your time with Listening Mind. Your presence here means more than you can imagine. If today's video has brought you value, a subscription and a like are a wonderful way to help us continue on this journey of reflection and empathy together. From the heart, thank you for being part of this space.